Thank you all for being here again. My name is Sai, and I'm not a cartographer. I mostly do historical geographic work, but this project is, in a lot of ways, a subset of my larger work that's come into direct confrontation and interrogation of the people and the past of cartography. And in many ways, this is a history of cartography at this really critical juncture in American society and in the wider world, where cartographers had an outsized amount of power and really shaped the world in a very kind of unseen way that I think has a lot of valences and a lot of power in what we're doing today. So I kind of want to bring up that story and hopefully show some parallels to things that you might be doing and the cartographic work that you may be engaged in, while also inspiring. So in many ways, my initial case was inspired by a run-on sentence. That run-on sentence is right here. It is a section from the Treaty of Sèvres, which was one of the several treaties that ended the First World War in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference. This particular treaty was directed at the Ottoman Empire, which was largely dismembered and split between the victorious Allied powers. And as you can see by this particular run-on sentence, I still laugh at it every time. It's so unnecessary. But extensive provisions were given to the creation of a brand new border that had never existed before in Western Anatolia around the modern-day city of Izmir. And this border basically allocated an area along the Aegean coast that was given to the Kingdom of Greece. This area had not been conquered in the war. This area had not been a separate kind of polity of any sense. This was brand new and incredibly detailed, which causes some problems, especially when we think of the other popular sorts of dialogues going on around borders in the Middle East that came out of this same treaty, which were largely lines in the sand. People hear about Sykes-Picot, all that sort of thing, and the problems that have been caused by just these arbitrary boundaries in the Middle East, again, from this same document, from this same time, the same peace process. So that really led me to the question of why? Why on earth was this border so detailed? And critically, this border was one of the few that did not last in that process. This was an incredibly ephemeral border, lasting only from its creation in 1920 till the occupation by Turkish national movement soldiers in 1922. And then this area has been an integral part of Turkey since then, not disputed at all. Definitely a unique case, so I wanted to dive into it. And that led me to some incredible cartography. So, one of the most important parts at play here, I've found, is that American cartographers and geographers had a very outsized role in creating this particular border, especially in reference to all the other borders that were created and discussed in the peace conferences. American geographers had a lot of say in what happened here, and that, in my opinion, led to a lot of the very unique kind of spatial patterns that developed. And the really unique cartography that surrounded those decisions. So this is two different maps. One, I guess I must say I am a cartographer because I made the the Google Earth map. I drew the polygon of where this border would have been. So I'm here. But more importantly, this map on the further side of the screen is the original map that accompanied that peace treaty, the Treaty of Sèvres, and was disseminated to all the signatory parties. This, again, kind of difficult to read. It's a very old sort of map, and the lines depicting the water are a lot. But really importantly, you see this zone of Smyrna, or Smyrna district, that's been drawn around with these, again, very bizarre borders that did not match up with natural landforms in the area, did not match up with previous administrative divisions in the area, but brand new border along this area to create a zone of Smyrna. But really interestingly to me, looking down here, oh, got it, you can see my pointer. At the author of this map, we find a Colonel Lawrence Martin, who, on further research, is the same Lawrence Martin who was a physiographer and professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and ended up becoming later on the president of the American Geographical Society, and for my friends in the State Department here, one of the geographers of the United States in that particular office. So what on earth is he doing as a colonel, and what on earth is he doing as the author of this map that was used by all the allies, this American geographer? And I would add, sorry, there's a lot of context with this, but the Americans were not actually signatories of this particular document. So what's going on? Why? So found out a little more. He was actually breveted as a military officer to direct cartography for the American delegation at the Paris Peace Conference. This was before the OSS existed. This was before there was any sort of set governmental way of approaching this. In a lot of ways, my project has kind of uncovered a prototype state cartography and how that was implemented in this really unique way at the First World War in a time that often is not addressed. Usually we see these same sorts of developments that I'll be showing in cartography only later in the Second World War, and we sort of attribute that within the foundations of the discipline. But some really cool echoes to an earlier moment where this really took off. So, very briefly, the central role of American geographers in this treaty negotiation, I'm going to lay out just some of the history here. In 1917, when the United States entered the war, it did not actually declare war on the Ottoman Empire, thus not being a signatory in that particular treaty I talked about. But the American Geographical Society, headed by Isaiah Bowman, who might also be a familiar name to those with background in the history of geography, he places the AGS, American Geographical Society, at the basically disposal of the US government in order to pursue all of the, the geographical needs that we've been shown arise in wartime and especially in the peace process after a war. So the inquiry was basically established to coordinate research into post-war bordering, assuming an Allied victory. In 1918, with the armistice, this inquiry was actually disbanded, but the resources that were created and gathered for this process, and again, many of the academics who created the maps themselves and were very involved, were actually transferred over to a new body, the American Commission to Negotiate Peace, which was directly headed by President Woodrow Wilson, but again, very much led by Isaiah Bowman, a geographer. So that's really the body that I found a lot of really unique documents. And again, the very documents that would go to directly influence the policymakers who are drawing borders, creating them. And as I'll show, some of these, they had very, very, very uniquely detailed maps and a unique interest and imagination of this particular region of the world that let them have this outsized voice. But this is a picture of them. Some of them actually went to Paris with the peace conference and politicked there. We can see Isaiah Bowman seated right here, and then several other American geographers, historians, cartographers, anthropologists. Yeah, one moment. So actually, it's very important to note before I go further, one of the key takeaways from this work, and again, this is more dealt with in other aspects of historical geography that I do rather than the cartographic, but these experts actually carried with them a lot of the disciplinary mindsets that characterized the discipline at the time. First and foremost being, of course, geographic determinism, which is a very present force at this time. But basically, the mindsets that became baked into the work and the maps that were created and baked into the border that they were given sway over. So that's something that I definitely want to keep in mind in foreground, jumping into things. But let's look at the actual maps. Let's look at the documents, the artifacts that are this really unique look into how these decisions were made, who was making them, what was important to them in making them, and the tools that they had to begin to address such an endeavor. So, this is primarily an archival research project, and my research actually comes from the actual documents, actual letters, actual original data, and of course the maps that were created and disseminated between, contested of course, and exchanged between these experts at this American Commission to Negotiate Peace. These records are preserved at the National Archives. Archive Group 256.4 actually directly houses all the cartographic records of this body, not just limited to the Ottoman Empire, of course, but the entirety of the peace conference, which included Germany and Austria-Hungary and so on and so on. But there are 47 catalog cartographic records specifically pertaining to Asiatic Turkey as it was described. And those are preserved at Nara too, along with slide microfilm, which I have here a great example of a lot of the data, a lot of the letters, and a lot of the kind of documentation for these maps. Additionally, a time capsule of cartographic methods from this period is kind of very present in this all. One of the really fun things for me was seeing these maps and seeing how they were hand-drawn. And I'll actually talk about in just a moment basically the use of base maps as this actual analytic tool. But each map includes original commentary with instructions for reproduction and modification of this map, keeping in mind that these maps were tools to be used for policy. These were functional objects. These were objects with power. So this is one of my favorites from that collection. A really great example, actually, of this kind of improvisational work that was needed at this time. This is a German base map that was taken from an atlas just because there's a lot of reasons. One was a lack of other good sources, other good base maps, and the lack of time to create their own. But additionally, there is a very serious commitment to data and accuracy that I've been able to trace with this project. So while the methods might be rustic, the data is serious. And I think that's something that's important that we need to keep in mind when looking back at the past of this discipline. So this particular map uses a base map from the cartographers F.A. Brockhaus in Leipzig. And of course, German cartographers were preferred in some of the letters that were described in the archives due to the accuracy and quality of the data that they included in their base maps. And again, the granularity of resolution, which was possible with the German maps that was not present in English language maps at the time for a lot of reasons. But as you can see, this is not just any plain German Brockhaus atlas. It has been superimposed with essentially a choropleth, which shows Greek populations in each essentially kaza or county equivalent district within Western Turkey. And again, it's very difficult to see down here, but this sort of legend that was just attached and handwritten and basically stapled onto the sides of these maps is very much par for the course with these documents. Just an incredible way. You can see that these were, again, working documents that people were actively poring over, actively editing, actively interacting with. In a way, interactive maps, as much as one can have those with paper and old German atlases. So, these are all really cool maps, and I loved poring over them, but what is the actual significance of this, especially to cartographers? So through some of my research of these artifacts, it reveals essentially a prototype spatial data analysis that may have been developing before a lot of that spatial data analysis is really acknowledged in American cartography at a much later date after the Second World War. These artifacts, again, reveal several insights into the amounts, basically what amounts to this prototype version of spatial data analysis that I hope might even be recognizable to GI scientists today. Considering the limitations of contemporaneous methods, the degree to which cartographers confronted and basically similar demands as are common today for why we need to do spatial data analysis, as would later take form through the quantitative revolution, approach results almost resembling relatively modern mapping. It's very impressive to me that a watercolored choropleth, again, keeping in mind that they didn't have modern color theory, so please forgive them for having very interesting choices of colors with their bins. But it's approaching something that might be possible if you were tasked with doing the similar level of analysis without the aid of a lot of the tools that developed to create space for that analysis. So again, this choropleth map with, again, qualitative color progression, it's noting that it really is something that they paid a lot of serious attention to, and it shows that methods that we think of happening later might have been present earlier. Of course, this is not the first use of choropleth mapping. Choropleth mapping existed before this. However, the term did not exist, and it's worth noting that John Kirtland Wright, who actually coined that term later in the 1940s, was the librarian of the AGS at this time, was actually very involved with this process. I wasn't able to find his name on any of the actual maps that were done, but he was present, and it's very apparent going through this work that his experiences with the American Commission offer explanation for his future work in geographic subjectivity. So, some conclusions. First of all, this is a really, really fun kind of depiction of the role of cartographers, but I really want to make it incredibly serious. While it might be great to just imagine that cartographers were sitting around waiting to let's figure out what the world's gonna look like so that we can finally map it with our pipes and all. Cartographers were incredibly active participants in this, who had a very strong say in what happened and in creating very unique spatial delineations in the world that caused very severe issues. And I think that's something that we need to be very conscious of, especially keeping in mind the degree to which cartographers are increasingly called upon nowadays to offer similar levels of insight, expertise, and science. So again, the unique positionality of these American geographers and cartographers as spatial scientists presages the role of the discipline as it would develop in this really critical moment in the rise of basically the American Empire. For those of you who know Neil Smith, this is the moment where it kind of sparks that this is possible and that American geographers can very actively be involved. And again, a distal case, while again, this case is very distal, this is halfway across the world, this small area that did not last in Western Turkey, but it was intimately formed by American geographers and their investment in it. And I think that's very critical. That's something that we need to be very aware of. In many senses also, this is a cautionary tale. If the same scientificization and seriousness that was applied back then is still applied now, which it should be, that does not mean that we won't face negative externalities with our work. And again, I think this is really important in bringing the case of, again, this power of cartography back to a pre-World War II moment is, again, this boundary delineation that was incredibly well thought out, incredibly well done, incredibly well researched and based in data, totally collapsed and resulted in largely ethnic cleansing and a lot of serious problems in that area. And we still see Greco-Turkish border conflict to this day in many senses. So again, this is a very important thing to keep in mind. If there are methods characteristic of a later quantitative revolution that might be occurring earlier, we should be able to trace that continuity and be able to ask ourselves as spatial experts to basically reckon with that while also pursuing even more serious, even more conscientious methods, and again, equipped with much more modern tools that hopefully will be able to be used effectively. And with that, I'd like to thank you all and be open to questions. Not just one document, it was a whole wild time. I found many, and there were very distinct reasons for almost every turn within it. Some of it was more political than other parts. A lot of the southern boundary ended up being diplomats deciding basically Italy gets this chunk and not Greece. But much, I would say, roughly 60 to 70% of the actual delineated boundary was just done based on existing, basically, population, existing demographic, existing ethnic kind of mapping and data that existed. And yeah, so again, this is such a weird, unique case, and I wish I had more time to give more into it. But that was the whole point of the Zone of Smyrna, was it was viewed in the academic community and the wider world that this part of the Ottoman Empire was inherently Greek and was largely populated by Greek Orthodox Christians who needed to be protected and separated out from the oppressive Muslim Turks. And that was sort of the whole MO for why this was even considered seriously in the first place. But because it was, again, this Wilsonian self-determination sort of project, it lent itself very easily to, again, the scientific method of let's delineate exactly where this Greek, inherently Greek place is. Because if we can organize the world perfectly, then we won't have to do wars and everyone will have a spot for themselves, right? So.
The nice thing is not what happened, obviously, but the 100-year later view is the power of unintended consequences.
Precisely.
For the power of our work.
Absolutely, and that's definitely something I wanted to present to this spot, not being a cartographer properly, but I have, again, encountered again and again the power of this work, and I definitely take it seriously, and I know you all do too, but yeah, definitely it's worth looking back, especially with this 100-year sort of retrospective. Thank you so much.